You won't believe what happened. I'm still shaking, running it all back in my head, the smell of burnt toast and cheap perfume mixing in my memory, a memory now forever tainted by the siren's wail. I'm talking about the day the HOA tried to evict my wife from our own home. It sounds insane, doesn't it? But trust me, the insanity was just getting started because the woman who called 911 on my wife, she had no idea who she was messing with. A little hint: my wife's job doesn't just involve knowing the police, she practically is the police, at least in this state. Before we dive into the chilling details of how this all went down, comment which country you're watching from and what the worst HOA story you've ever heard is. It was a perfect Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the sunlight streams through the kitchen window and turns the dust motes into tiny, dancing diamonds. I was nursing my second cup of coffee, reading the digital news, while Sarah, my brilliant, beautiful wife, was outside, already tackling her pet project, landscaping the front yard. Our little slice of suburban heaven was in the Willow Creek Estates, a neighborhood known for its immaculate lawns and, unfortunately, its overly zealous homeowners association. Our HOA president, a woman named Beverly, was the type who corrected grammar in neighborhood emails and considered a slightly faded paint chip an act of moral decay. We called her Beverly the Barbarian, though only in the safety of our own home. Sarah was on a ladder, hanging a freshly stained cedar trellis, humming a tune from a 90s rock band as she worked the drill with practiced ease. The sound of power tools was usually the most dramatic thing that happened on our street, a mundane, comforting background noise to a predictable day. Suddenly I heard a car door slam, not a normal slam, but a dramatic, angry thwack that vibrated through the quiet morning air and made me look up from my screen. I glanced out the window and immediately recognized Beverly's gleaming, black SUV parked directly on the curb, which ironically was probably an HOA violation in itself. She emerged, a vision of pristine white linen and oversized sunglasses, marching toward our property line like a general surveying a battlefield. She had a clipboard clutched in her hand like a weapon, and her expression was set in that rigid mask of self-righteous fury that always signaled impending conflict. I instinctively sighed, bracing myself, knowing this encounter was going to sour the rest of my morning. I watched as Beverly stopped directly beneath Sarah's ladder, tilting her head back to address my wife, her voice carrying that sharp, nasal quality that always seemed to be tuned to the exact frequency of annoyance. "Mrs. Maxwell?" Beverly shrieked, making Sarah nearly drop the drill. "What do you think you are doing? That color stain is not an approved rustic cedar blend B from the designated palette. It's clearly a spiced mahogany, and it violates Article 7, subsection C of the Community Covenants." Sarah, ever the picture of cool under pressure, carefully secured the drill to her belt before climbing down a few rungs to meet Beverly's gaze. "Good morning, Beverly. Actually, this is rustic cedar blend B. I have the receipt and the approved swatch right inside," Sarah replied calmly, her tone polite but firm, the slight Texas drawl in her voice becoming more pronounced as it often did when she was annoyed. Beverly, however, wasn't interested in receipts or facts. She was interested in exercising her perceived authority, which was always the crux of any confrontation with her. "I don't need to see your little receipt, Mrs. Maxwell. I have eyes," Beverly declared, tapping the clipboard with a long, perfectly manicured finger that looked like it had never lifted anything heavier than a champagne flute. "The sheer hue is offensive and frankly, it lowers the aesthetic value of the entire block. I'm issuing you an immediate notice of noncompliance, which carries a $300 fine effective immediately, and you have 48 hours to remove this abomination." The emphasis she placed on the word abomination was so theatrical it almost made me laugh, but the seriousness in her eyes kept the smile away. Sarah, who was the most meticulous person I knew, just shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke volumes of her exasperation with the woman and her endless, petty rules. The argument was already spiraling, becoming exactly the neighborhood spectacle Beverly seemed to crave, and I knew I had to go out there before things completely devolved into a shouting match that would surely draw the attention of the perpetually gossiping neighbors across the street. I pushed open the front door and stepped onto the porch, intending to be the voice of reason, the soothing intermediary in this domestic crisis over wood stain. But before I could utter a single word, Beverly took a step back, her face turning a shade of mottled crimson. "And don't think you can play the we're a couple card. You two are always pushing the boundaries, always thinking the rules don't apply to your eccentric choices. I'm tired of it. I'm calling the authorities. I will have this structure and its defiant owner removed from this property." With a dramatic flourish that was utterly uncalled for, she snatched her phone from her pristine white trouser pocket and jammed it to her ear, loudly announcing to no one in particular, "I am contacting the authorities right now. This is trespassing. This is criminal property damage." My mouth fell open and I saw Sarah's jaw clench, her eyes narrowing as she watched Beverly's insane performance escalate from a petty fine to a legal threat. The moment Beverly shouted that she was calling the authorities, a chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the morning sun. It wasn't the threat itself that bothered me. We both knew Beverly was prone to hyperbole and baseless intimidation. It was the sheer audacity of her action, the way she seemed to genuinely believe that her clipboard and her HOA title granted her the power to summon state forces over a color of stain. She began speaking into the phone, her voice shrill and theatrical, obviously embellishing the situation for the 911 operator. Yes, I need the police immediately. I am the president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA and we have a very aggressive individual on private property, a vandal really, who is refusing to comply with a lawful order to cease and desist. She's damaging property and causing a public disturbance. I feel threatened and intimidated. Send units now. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the ladder's rungs, but I could see a muscle ticking rapidly in her cheek, a sign that her legendary patience was wearing dangerously thin. Across the street, old Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Harwinkle had already appeared on their respective porches, their faces a mixture of confusion and keen interest, their usual morning routine abandoned for the unfolding spectacle. Beverly, seeing her audience growing, puffed out her chest, radiating self-importance. She ended the call with a curt, triumphant "Thank you, officer," making it sound as if she had just personally commanded the entire police force. She then dropped her phone back into her pocket and crossed her arms, fixing Sarah with a smug, expectant look, clearly savoring the moment of ultimate victory she thought she had orchestrated. "Well, Mrs. Maxwell," Beverly sneered, her voice dripping with condescending superiority, "it seems your reign of rebellious landscaping is finally coming to an end. They're on their way. I suggest you step away from that ladder and wait for the officers. You are about to be escorted off this property, and I will be filing a restraining order to ensure you never violate another one of our beautiful, orderly covenants again." The word restraining order hung in the air, a final, spiteful shot fired in her pointless little war. I finally found my voice, stepping forward onto the lawn. "Beverly, you need to calm down. You just called 911 for a wood stain violation. That's an abuse of the emergency system and this is our property. My wife is a co-owner," I stated, trying to inject some much-needed reality into the surreal situation, but she cut me off with a dismissive wave of her hand as if I were merely a persistent insect. "You're just as bad as she is. Clearly the two of you have no respect for the community rules we all agreed to uphold," she spat, her eyes flashing with a deep personal resentment that went far beyond the color of the cedar. Then the faint yet unmistakable sound of a siren began to drift through the morning air, growing louder, closer. Beverly's face broke into a wide, triumphant smile, the kind of expression that makes your stomach clench with dread. "See, they're here." Justice moved swiftly in Willow Creek Estates. The squad car, an official state police cruiser, lights flashing but siren now silent, rolled slowly to a stop right in front of our driveway. Two officers emerged. They were both tall, impeccably uniformed men in crisp dark blue, their duty belts laden with gear, looking every bit like the professional law enforcement they were. As they approached, Beverly practically skipped to meet them, launching into a rapid, breathless account of the crime, pointing dramatically at Sarah and the unfinished trellis. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This woman is a menace. She's vandalizing property and refused to comply with my order as the HOA president. She's hostile and refuses to leave the property. She's claiming to live here, but that's impossible given her behavior. I need her removed and cited for trespassing and destruction of property." Beverly's voice was a frantic, high-pitched whine. The two officers listened patiently, their faces impassive, occasionally glancing from Beverly to the calm figure of Sarah standing beside the ladder. Finally, one of the officers, a muscular man with a serious expression and a name tag that read Officer Reynolds, raised a hand to halt Beverly's tirade. "Ma'am, we understand your concern," Officer Reynolds began, his voice deep and measured, "but we need to assess the situation. Is this woman claiming to live here?" Beverly was about to launch into another diatribe when Sarah finally moved. She took one step forward, planting her feet on our lawn, and gently adjusted the collar of her work shirt, a small, subtle gesture that somehow commanded all the attention in the small crowd now forming. Sarah looked Officer Reynolds directly in the eye, and the tiny, subtle movement in the air, the slight shift of power, was immediately palpable. "Officer, I do live here. This is my property, jointly owned with my husband right there," Sarah said, pointing a thumb over her shoulder at me. Her voice was low and steady, radiating an authority that instantly clashed with Beverly's frantic hysteria. Then, with a deliberate slowness that was positively cinematic, she reached into her back pocket, pulled out her wallet, flipped it open, and extended it toward the officer. "And I assure you, ma'am, Sarah continued, now addressing Beverly but never taking her eyes off the officer, a slow, knowing smile starting to form on her face. I'm not going anywhere. In fact, I think we have much more important things to discuss than wood stain. Officer Reynolds' eyes, which had been scanning the premises, finally dropped to the wallet in Sarah's outstretched hand. I watched as his jaw visibly dropped, the color draining instantly from his face. The other officer froze mid-step, his hand hovering over his belt. Beverly, still oblivious, let out a triumphant gasp. Finally, you'll see I was right, she crowed. But Officer Reynolds wasn't looking at Beverly, he was staring intently at the laminated card in Sarah's wallet, and the expression of shock and dawning realization on his face was absolutely priceless. Officer Reynolds' reaction was instantaneous and profound. He didn't just look at the card, he practically snapped to attention, his back straightening like a board. His partner, seeing Reynolds' sudden shift, immediately moved closer, curious, and then his eyes widened in an almost identical expression of shock. They were looking at Sarah's official state police ID, not just a standard badge or license, but the kind of identification that holds serious weight. Reynolds quickly adjusted his hat, his previously formal demeanor melting into a mixture of professional respect and sheer, utter disbelief. He saluted, not a casual, half-hearted gesture but a sharp, crisp salute that echoed across the strangely silent street. "Ma'am, my sincerest apologies," Officer Reynolds stammered, his voice now deferential and low, completely different from the measured tone he'd used with Beverly. I wasn't informed. We were dispatched on an unverified call regarding an aggressive trespasser and property vandal." Sarah simply nodded, the faint smile still playing on her lips, and slowly slid her ID back into her wallet. "I understand, officer, you were responding to a 911 call. That's your job," she said. She then turned her full attention to Beverly, who was standing frozen, her mouth agape, her triumphant smile curdled into confusion. The neighbors were now murmuring, leaning forward to try and catch the hushed exchange, their eyes darting between the saluting officer and my wife. "Beverly," Sarah began, her voice dropping to an ice-cold, authoritative register that I'd only heard her use when dealing with a tough case. "You called 911, an emergency line, and knowingly lied to a dispatcher to manufacture a police response over a civil matter that amounts to a difference of opinion on a paint color. You accused me, a homeowner, of trespassing on my own property and demanded I be removed. Do you know what that's called, Beverly?" Beverly tried to sputter out a defense, her face now rapidly losing all color. It was a violation, a clear violation," she squeaked, the starch entirely gone from her voice. Sarah didn't raise her voice, but every word she spoke carried the undeniable weight of law and authority. "It's called filing a false police report and misuse of the 911 system. Those are both crimes, Beverly. And since you seem to believe you have the authority to call the state police to our home, let me clear something up for you. I am Director Sarah Maxwell, Chief of Staff for the State Police Force. The officers standing right here report indirectly to me." The silence that followed was so thick you could almost hear the blood rush to Beverly's ears. Her sunglasses, which had been perched imperiously on her nose, suddenly seemed too big, hiding the sheer terror in her eyes. The clipboard slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the pristine concrete, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet tension. She looked like a statue carved out of fear. The two officers, standing at attention, confirmed the gravity of the situation simply by their presence and their respectful silence. Officer Reynolds stepped forward, but this time he was addressing Beverly, his voice now firm and accusatory. "Ma'am, based on the director's statement and the nature of your 911 call, we have a serious situation here. We are going to need you to come with us down to the precinct to file an official statement regarding the details of this emergency call." Beverly looked like she was about to faint. But the trellis, the rules," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "The only rule you broke, Beverly," Sarah interjected, stepping close to her, her expression unyielding, "was believing that a position of petty power in a suburban housing complex allows you to abuse the law and intimidate your neighbors. You brought the law here, now you deal with the consequences of your actions." The aftermath was swift and total. Beverly was escorted away in the back of the cruiser, not under arrest yet but certainly under a cloud of serious legal trouble. She didn't look back at the gaping crowd of neighbors whose whispers had now escalated into outright chatter. The final glorious irony came 2 days later. Sarah, not wanting the situation to linger, had the HOA's legal counsel contact us. Turns out, Beverly was not only stripped of her HOA presidency, but was also facing substantial fines for the false report and a civil suit from the HOA itself for creating a legal liability. The entire board resigned shortly thereafter, and the rustic cedar blend B trellis was officially given an exemption, becoming a legendary monument to the day. Karen learned the hard way that you don't call the state police on the person who signs their paychecks. We haven't had a single rule violation notice since, and the new, very quiet, very humble HOA president now sends us a friendly email every month asking if everything is up to our standards. It was a complete, final victory for justice and common sense over self-important tyranny. If you loved this story about authority, trust, and how a moment of humble revelation can bring down the self-righteous, hit the like button and share this with a friend. And let me know in the comments, what do you think Beverly's mugshot looked like?